Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you all here this morning again. We talked a lot about decarbonization yesterday, and this morning we're going to talk about CSR and sustainability, together with Céline Soubrane-Weber. Good morning. Céline graduated from Sciences Po and joined AXA in 2006. She held various positions in the group in communication, transformation, CSR. She's now in charge of sustainable development, guiding its ESG and climate strategy. We'll look at things from the point of view of an investor, an insurer, and a company. You're also deeply involved in biodiversity, as we shall see. To begin with, Céline, I said that yesterday we talked a lot about decarbonization. We talked about CSR, sustainability, environmental policy. Could you perhaps explain these ideas to us? They're quite close in terms of the underlying meaning, but they're used differently today. What does all this refer to? Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. We could start by talking about ESG, sustainable development. These are interesting concepts, but it's a bit like alphabet soup because there's so many acronyms. So it's not a bad idea to define the main terms, even if we're not talking about an exact science. CSR is the voluntary policy of a company. We're talking about the corporate social responsibility. Corporate responsibility or social responsibility. So it's the voluntary action taken by a company which deems it's responsible vis-à-vis the society and the community with which it works. And then sustainable development. Okay. So we've talked about CSR, and sustainable development goes a bit further than that. Sustainable development involves CSR, but it acquires a more economic dimension, a more commercial business stance. I became director of sustainable development as opposed to CSR when in AXA we wanted to show that we were incorporating this kind of development in a more commercial sense. The idea is to apply it systematically in all our economic and commercial dealings. In AXA, we use the two terms, however. AXA France, we have a CSR director. And then we have RSG, which is ESG, environment and social environment. This makes it possible to have a sustainable development strategy. ESG is based on an analysis from the stance of investment. You analyze a company in terms of what it's doing with the environment, social, and governance. We don't talk so much about the G in ESG. Perhaps we'll refer to it a bit later on. It's the way decisions are taken in a company that really sets companies apart. Sustainability is the title. Well, sustainability is the concept of sustainable development. How can we make sure that our activities, the activities of a private company or a state, will be sustainable over time for people on Earth, and we depend on nature as well, so things have to be sustainable over time. In the long term, it's a long-term vision, sustainability. I'll complicate matters a bit. So we're not talking about compliance in all this. Yes, increasingly, and that's what's changing a lot and ever more quickly. This is a notion that's really changing when it comes to CSR and sustainable development. For about 10 years, I've been working in this area, and what changed a great deal over the last 3 or 4 years is the fact that we have moved from a voluntary policy to a regulatory policy. You've talked about all these acronyms, CSRD, FDR, and others. These are all regulations which have to be complied with. These are regulations which the EU is adopting. The idea being to foster transparency and reporting obligations from a social environmental stance as applied to companies. And this will lead to a real transformation. It's because companies will be forced to publish that we'll establish standards in what needs to be published, and that will make it possible to avoid greenwashing or social washing or whatever. It's an abuse in terms of communication. The idea is to force companies to publish their environmental, social, and governance data in order to be able to compare them. Transparency will lead to transformation in practices. That's what the EU is betting on. Of course, the European Union is different from the US. You've heard about the SEC. And likewise, there are regulations which are beginning even in China in terms of CSR, and that's quite surprising. Let's talk about AXA. When did AXA start to become concerned with these matters and take them up? And after this growth in awareness, how did things really start to be implemented in the group? It's part of the group's DNA. Vivian, at the time, created this idea of a company for people, go beyond just business, and then AXA has a warm heart, so to speak. This was a disruptive idea. In 2002, we created the Sustainable Development Unit, and there was a speeding up as of 2015 when it comes to the climate. A world plus 4 degrees won't be sustainable. This wasn't just, these weren't empty words. And this applied to investment, for example, avoid investment in coal and extend investment in terms of insurance. And then we had a climate strategy, which has led now to our strategic plan up to 2023, which has comprised all these notions. 2021, for the very first time, we included the climate in our strategic plan. This is quite a change. It may appear to be just a detail to say we'll include this in the strategic plan, but on the contrary, we were able to do this thanks to our past history. You have to reach a given level of maturity. Now, all our lines of activity are concerned: investment, insurance, and as you said, everything we can do is an exemplary company when it comes to carbon footprint. We have 5 indicators currently to denote progress. It's the AXA Index for Progress. This is published. And in terms of our strategy, we have thus been committed ourselves up to 2023, 25, and 2050. You were talking about ESG. How do things pan out in this respect? We have 2 goals when it comes to investment. Obviously, the idea is to abide by the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees in terms of investment between now and 2050. We align our investment portfolio according to the goal of decarbonization. The medium-term goal is to reduce the carbon footprint of our investment portfolio by 20% by 2025. Soon we will probably announce a target for 2050. These long-term dates, when you publish them, people say, oh, you won't be here, and you won't be there to be accountable for what you've done. So the midterm goals are important. We want to ramp up a green investment, 24 billion, now it's 26 billion. Every time we can increase green investment, we do so. you need to have the relevant project pipeline. We've increased the target in the course of the plan, 26 billion by 2023. That's as an investor, as an insurer. You addressed the issue yesterday. You talked about the Poseidon principles. As you know, we have net zero insurance alliance now. A lot of your companies are probably involved in this adventure together with AXA. AXA chairs this alliance. The idea is to have a method for calculating the carbon footprint of investment portfolios across all activities. There'll be a target, a protocol for the methodology, and goals will be defined as of the beginning of 2023. In the meantime, AXA individually has a goal, namely to increase the positive impact investments up to 1.3 billion by 2023. When it comes to the social dimension of insurance, this is a topic we're increasingly looking into. I'll talk about it a bit later. We have a target when it comes to inclusive insurance products. We want this to involve 12,000 beneficiaries soon, and we want to include people who are excluded from these normal policies. And as an exemplary company, we'll be training all our employees about the climate. We have 110,000 employees around the world, and last fall we launched things, and 60% of our headcount has been trained. The goal is to attain 100% by the end of the year. We firmly believe that we need to ramp up the skills of our employees to meet our targets, and we have the carbon footprint of our own activities. We have to be exemplary in this area. The goal is a reduction of 20% by 2025, including digital activities. 25% may not look like a lot, but as we have 15% growth in terms of digital activities, you'll readily understand that that's quite challenging. You talked about the Poseidon principles. Yesterday, we had a very clear explanation of them. Did you sign them, and when did you do so? What's your position? AXA is deeply involved in the Poseidon principles. The aim overall is to measure the carbon footprint of all our portfolios, but you need to have the carbon data of your customer to do so. Obviously, we're not going to take 100% of the carbon data of our customers. The idea is to apportion the share of responsibility and find the right computational model, the right equation. So indeed, this is why we need the data. And in maritime insurance, we do have the data. That's very valuable. And so we have indeed embarked on this procedure. What are the next stages? You talked about 2024, 2050. What are the next main stages? We're also thinking about the social pillar currently. You have the growth in social inequality, social fragmentation. This is nothing new, of course, but I do believe that we need to give priority to the climate. Granted, there's no social you need social inclusion is obvious if the temperature increases by 4 degrees. Climate change, access to food, certain areas will become uninhabitable, so social fragmentation will be enhanced. But there is some kinds of social fragmentation that are not linked to climate, so we want to reinforce the social pillar. The acceleration in terms of climate activities is a fact. Things are speeding up. We have this thrust within AXA to speed up activity. We need also to abide by the regulations and even anticipate. What we have said is that there are signals that show that regulations will also change in terms of the social pillar. For all these reasons, we have decided to work increasingly on inclusive insurance. We have calculated that even in our so-called developed mature countries, there are between 20 and 30%, depending on the country in Europe, of people who don't have access to financial protection. Our goal is 12 million thanks to an entity called AXA Emerging Customers. We have this climate link. We have insurance linked to climate change. So with AXA Climate and AXA Emerging Customers, we cover 9 million people, and we intend to develop this further, particularly in the so-called mature countries. We want to cover up to 12 million people who normally are excluded from this kind of insurance. That's one of my next challenges, so to speak. When you listen to you, it all appears very simple. You're setting up new protocols. Aren't there obstacles and difficulties? Isn't there any opposition, in fact? Insurance isn't not perhaps the most environmentally friendly sector, the one that's ahead of the game. Well, you're quite right. That's quite an issue. It's a daily dilemma for us. I wouldn't be as severe as you when talking about our sector. I don't think insurance is lagging behind other sectors. We started a bit faster on the investor side because we're all big investors. And when it comes to insurance, things are changing rapidly now. As a group, we do have work to do when it comes to decarbonization. These are daily challenges. Look at the climate and biodiversity. There's quite a dilemma there. Climate change is putting pressure on ecosystems, and hence we're losing different species of flora and fauna. At the same time, if we lose natural ecosystems, mangroves, for example, we'll be less resilient when it comes to natural disasters. It's a vicious circle, in other words. Well, it needs to be properly managed. There's a link between climate and biodiversity, but there's a dilemma here as well. Look at hydropower dams. That's a decarbonized energy, which is wonderful for the climate. But when you build a hydroelectric dam, you submerge ecosystems, you upset biodiversity and the whole ecosystem in the area. So it's a real dilemma. We talked about wind farms too. The land becomes artificial, you upset the ecosystem, you upset the landscape. Landscape is a source of well-being. So you have to manage all these dilemmas, all these contradictions when you're making a choice. And in a company, you do have to make choices. For example, when we excluded oil, okay, there was a loss in business, so it took a lot of courage to do so. However, we took this decision because by excluding certain things, it makes it possible to shift in terms of our activities and our know-how. Bit by bit, on a voluntary basis, we're going to cease investing in oil, and that will make us keener to turn to other sectors like renewable energy, the decarbonized sector. You have to be very humble. We're learning a great deal every day. We're making choices. We're learning. In AXA, there's no existing book that tells you how you should go about things. There is no process that's been predefined. You have to learn, test and learn. Currently, for example, when it comes to exclusion, we continue to believe that exclusion from insurance is absolutely necessary given climate change, but exclusion should be less binary. So what we're trying to do is to change things in light of the experience we're acquiring every day. You said that you were changing as a person, but what about your colleagues? What does this change in their daily existence? You talked about training. 60% of people have already been trained about the climate. In your daily work, does this have a real impact? I don't know. I'm not familiar with the daily lives of all the employees, but I have 1,200 employees in France today who are deeply engaged in the climate. They've set up a sort of a group, and they're deeply committed to raise awareness amongst other colleagues. They want to change their daily life at work, sort waste at work. They've really invested in climate, but things go further than that. They're asking us to be accountable. Why are we investing in total energy, for example? There are votes in general assemblies, and people ask for justification. And this is something that we really sense within the social corpus. And we can see how successful training about the climate has been. 60% of our colleagues will have been trained by the fall. This training lasts 3.5 hours. You have to set aside the time. We're all extremely busy, but it proves that there's strong motivation in this area. What I have noted personally, and this is wonderful when you're in charge of sustainable development, I've noted that many proposals are increasingly coming from the various departments. It used to be sustainable development departments which said, oh, we'll have to exclude gas, we'll have to do this or that, we'll have to have a policy to protect ecosystems and forests. Now these suggestions are coming up from the other departments and lines of activity, and that's a wonderful thing to observe. The media has talked a lot about greenwashing. What's your view in that respect? You have to be careful about that. Greenwashing, well, there have been accusations. What about a proper definition? Greenwashing is when a company makes claims that it's green, that it's engaged in terms of sustainable development and the climate, but these claims are not borne out by fact. That is greenwashing.
Now, I would say amongst the accusations of greenwashing, we have our favorite NGO, Reclaim Finance, that regularly accuses us of greenwashing, but these are wrong accusations. Our commitments are public and we abide by them and there's no breach. Now, when it comes to AWS, it's a bit more worrying. AWS, that's the Deutsche Bank subsidiary that is accused of greenwashing by the regulator. That's a bit more of a problem. And so it seems that the funds that it classified as green are not really green. So now courts, it will be decided by the courts. And so I think that we need to be very rigorous. Rigor, humility, also learning. And as well, that's why it's so important to have methodologies and metrics for accountability. We need to be very cautious and also genuine in our commitment. Earlier, you talked about exclusions. Is there a risk for the players listening to us that you would refuse to cover in aviation or maritime some transport players, and for what reasons? Well, exclusions, I mean, you're even more expert than I am, but exclusions are part of insurance. But that's part of the job. Well, the logic of exclusions that we've put in place for coal and oil is that as alternatives become available, gradually we need to withdraw from the sector in order to create appetite for other sectors. That was the rationale. Now, clearly, we need, as I said earlier, we need to look at the transition pathways. Now we are going to look at that even more deeply, and we'll work on that even more at AXA. What will matter is where a company is in its transition journey rather than having a binary black or white approach. We know that the decarbonization pathway, although it's urgent, although the climate issue, there's daily pressure, we know that industrial and technological transformation that underpins it is not easy. So we'll look at the pathways and journeys more and more. By way of conclusion, could I ask you for some concrete advice for those who would like to undertake a sustainability approach in their companies? What should they start with? What would you promote? My advice that I still apply on a daily basis, because although now we cover a lot of activities at AXA, there's always one that I discover and I'm thinking, oh, there's something to be done there. So you should always start small. That's my advice. Start small. Start with what's easy. And what's easy, what seems easy already, requires some effort in a company. But those quick wins are very important. That is what will help you prove to the organization what is possible. So start with the easiest, the most straightforward things to start the momentum. That's the advice that I would give everybody. If there are young talents that want to start in this area, or people who want to start their sustainability journey in more established companies, start small, start with the most obvious things. Thank you so much, Céline Soubranne-Weber. Thank you.